2 Kings chapter 6, beginning in verse 24. A few weeks ago, I invited a friend of mine by the name of David Matthews to come and speak for us. Many of you were here that day, and universally, at least to me, the feedback was extremely positive about David. Well, because of that positive feedback, I've invited another one of my friends, Jeff King, to speak here next Sunday. Jeff is a tremendous speaker. I think you will thoroughly enjoy his being here. Jeff is pretty direct. And so he's not a kind of speaker that you walk away going, he was just there to be polite. He's pretty direct about what he says, but he's a fascinating speaker, very powerful in what he talks about. And so I think that you will definitely want to make sure that you're here next Sunday and invite your friends to be here next Sunday to hear Jeff King speak. Just let you know about that. We've been working through Old Testament stories this summer, and it was during this week when I realized that picking summer to go through Old Testament stories might not have been the best choice, and here's why. The Old Testament stories are very earthy. What I mean by that is they deal with situations of life as they really are, and some of the situations are a little difficult to talk about when all the kids are in here rather than going out to kicks. And as much as this story is going to be tough, it's one of the milder ones. I mean, I can't tell you the number that I've said, no, not with the kids, no, not with the kids. And even at that, when I read through this one, you're going to go, with the kids? Trust me, it's one of the milder ones. 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 24 beginning. Now, sometime later, or at a later time than this, what's happening here is a lot of time has passed. We've been staying for a while with the stories having to do with the prophet Elisha. And one of the stories about the prophet Elisha that we've looked at is when a fellow by the name of Naaman, who was from Syria, another word for that is Aram, had come over, and when he came over, he was healed of his leprosy, okay? Now, some time had passed since then, and the king of Aram, or the king of Syria, had decided that he was going to create war against Israel. Now, that's not unusual. First of all, when you think of kings, we probably think of these big monarchies and these huge nations, but the nations in that part of the world tended not to be that big, and they tended to fight with each other all the time. Anybody ever read the humorist Dave Barry out of Miami by any chance? I would love to read Dave. Dave suggests that if nuclear war took place, which would kill all the animals, interestingly except cockroaches, they would live through nuclear war. He said the cockroaches that lived in the Middle East would still be fighting each other. So here they are over there, the king of Aram. This Ben-Hadad, that's the name of the king of Aram, pulled together his troops and launched a siege on Samaria. That's where the Israelis are. The next verse says, this brought on a terrible famine, so bad that food prices soared astronomically. 80 shekels for a donkey's head, 5 shekels for a bowl of field greens. Now, this is the message, which is a paraphrase. He's being very polite there. He's saying field greens. Actually, in the Hebrew, it refers to dove's dung. What he's saying is that they are totally and completely out of food. What do you mean? Well, when you came up to a fortified city, you could do it a couple of ways. One is you could charge the walls, but that could lose you a lot of troops. Because the other people, if they're inside that fortified city, would put their archers up on those walls, and when you came up against them, they'd shoot those arrows, and they'd take out a lot of your people. In addition, they'd also boil oil, and when you got close enough, they'd just tip those cauldrons over, and they'd scald you to death. And sometimes they had flammable liquid, and they'd pour that over, and they'd burn you to death. And so rushing the walls was a pretty tough way to go. You may remember there's an Old Testament story about when God's people came against Jericho. God decided to do that city differently and just blew the walls down. So typically, if they came against a fortified city, if it was a small enough city, they might charge it directly, but more often, they would just camp around it, cut off all the supplies, and wait till the food ran out. And that's what they've done here. They have waited for the food to run out. And so people are eating donkeys' heads. I'm sure in some cultures that would be just fine. I've been hungry, but not that hungry yet. And look what they're selling for. The food's astronomical. Why? Well, in times of great need, people who care about people share the resources. In times of great need, people who care only about themselves exploit resources. So look at the next verse. It says, on one day, the king of Israel was walking around the city wall. What's he doing? He's looking at what's going on out there. These people who are camped outside, who are waiting for his people to starve enough that they finally come out and fight or open or just die. A woman cried out, "Help, your majesty." He answered, "If God won't help you, where on earth can I go for help? By the way, note that, because in a minute it's going to be important that that's what he said. If God won't help you, where on earth can I go for help? To the granary? To the dairy? Can you tell this guy's frustrated? Where am I going to get anything to give you? Look at the next verse. It says, the king continued, okay, tell me your story. She said, this woman came up to me and said, give up your son and we'll have him for today's supper. Tomorrow, we'll eat my son. Now, before we go to the next verse, just picture that. Imagine somebody being so hungry that they're going to eat their children. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that just does not compute. I mean, how many mothers here would say that goes so against my maternal instincts? I mean, I would never consume my child just for me to live. I would put my needs so far behind the needs, or so far behind the needs of my child that I would literally starve to death before my child would, because I'd be doing everything I could to scrap together any piece of food to feed my child. I would go without. My child would eat for days beyond my last meal, because I would do everything to help him or her continue to exist. How many of you mothers believe that you would feel or think that way? How many fathers believe you would think or feel that way? Now, we know that there are people in the world who don't think that way about their children. We read about or hear about that in some parts of the world there are some people who sell their children into slavery. There are some parts of the world where, because of the fact that people are so destitute, so much in poverty, that particularly with their girl children, when the girl gets 6, 7, 8, somewhere around there, they take them into the city and they sell them into slavery. A nice way to say they sell them into prostitution, so that they have money and they go back to their small farms or places that they live in. And when we read or hear about that, it repulses us, but it doesn't extract too much emotion from us, because it's so far away and so distant that while the idea is terrible, we can't really relate to it, because we think that would never, ever happen in America. Or if it were to happen in America, it would be so rare, such an anomaly, that it would never be anybody that we would know. We'd never run into anybody where that had actually happened to him or her. And it would be in some other place. It would never be in Middle Tennessee. And so therefore we don't have to deal with it. It doesn't really exist in our world. There are other parts of the world where that the population is so controlled that when parents have children, if it's a girl child, they destroy her. They do whatever it takes to end her life because they want a boy child for various reasons. Maybe part of it's because they want to continue the family name, and the boy would do that. Maybe part of it's because he can work sooner, he can help support them quicker. There are all kinds of reasons, but they just eliminate the female. And again we go, okay, that happens in some parts of the world, and it's repulsive to hear about. We don't even want to think about it, but it's not us. So we don't have to think about those things because it doesn't happen here. Yet, with that maternal instinct or that paternal instinct, where we would say, I would put my needs, my desires, my wishes, whatever, so far behind those of my child that I would protect him or her, I would provide for him or her. I'm telling you that if you really think about it, in our country, we have an amazing number of people who just don't do that. Just yesterday, I heard a grown man telling the story about when he was a boy. He said, every day of my childhood. Now, that's probably hyperbole, but I'm thinking that's the way he remembers it. Whether it happened every day or not, that's how it seems to him now that he's a man. He said, every day of my childhood, my father beat me again and again and again. He was telling that story in reference to how he makes some decisions in his life now. Another person, just yesterday, I heard telling a story about some of the things I do, some of the decisions I make in life. I'm quite sure, based on the fact that I was so abandoned when I was a child. Not long ago, another lady I know, as a matter of fact, this lady actually works with me, said, one of my earliest memories, I couldn't have been more than 4, was my standing at a screen door with my hands up against the screen, thinking, wishing, craving that somebody would hold me, and that I wished it would be my mother, but that I was alone. And that more often than not, my siblings and I, none of whom were even in elementary school yet, that my siblings and I, because my mother was entertaining another of her friends, would go across the back alleys and through a hole in the fence over to a relative's house to stay for a while because she was just not wanting us around. We hear those stories all the time about people who were abandoned physically or abandoned emotionally. People who were beaten physically. Oh, and you can understand the other stories that I won't go into, which I could, in greater detail because we do have so many young people here. The sexual abuse stories that are just rampant. A few years ago, they made an estimate. They made an estimate about people in conservative churches, that would be churches like ours, about the number of teenagers that have already in churches like ours, not the Western Hills Church per se, you understand, but churches of our culture who have been sexually abused. The number was staggering. 1 out of 6. It's pretty amazingly high, don't you think? I think that's probably true. Several years ago, back when they still invited me to speak at youth rallies, back when my hair was brown. You understand, when my hair turned gray, for some reason they quit inviting me to youth rallies, or it could be just because of the fact that the teenagers quit listening to me. That could have been a factor. I don't know. I remember once I was up speaking, and you probably noticed, if you've heard me speak very much, that sometimes I kind of go off on a tangent I had not planned. It just happened. Now, Brother John, my dear friend that I love dearly, he says when he does that, it's the Holy Spirit. Maybe. I don't always blame the Holy Spirit for my ramblings. He might be involved. More often it's me. But on this particular occasion, I went off on a tangent, speaking to, I don't know, a couple of thousand teenagers down in Birmingham, Alabama, at a big thing they used to do called Youth in Action back in the day. And I happened to often mention something about, if you have been abused, you need to tell us so we can help you. It was just off to the side. Wasn't even thinking about it. And then, of course, when they offered the invitation song, and we didn't expect anybody else to respond because Jeff Walling had spoken the night before. And on the 67th verse of Just As I Am, 2 million people had responded. As a matter of fact, the way I introduced myself the next day, I said, Jeff and I went to the restaurant last night. And the waiter responded. But it was on the 14th verse. So all of a sudden, people were streaming to the front, young people, and they were telling stories. It would break your heart. And we didn't know how to help them. Nobody expected the stories. This had not been planned. So they invited me back next year, and when they invited me, they said, are you going to mention that again? And I said, yeah. Last year, it was either the Holy Spirit or my rambling. Maybe it was God because of what happened, but this year it's going to happen. I'm going to mention it. And they said, we don't know how to deal with that. And I said, well, if you're going to invite me, you better get ready. So they had a class. Dr. Al Milligan from Montgomery did a class for all the chaperones and youth ministers and stuff before I spoke. He did the class for them, and he came out. I happened to just be walking by as he came out, and he was shaking his head, and he said, we're in trouble. Why are we in trouble, Al? They can't help them. What do you mean? Half of them have had that happen, and they've never had anybody help them deal with it. They're falling apart in there. They're not going to help these kids. They don't know how. And yet, if I were to read this story to those parents and say, would you eat your kid? No! I would never put my needs, my desires, my wishes, my problems ahead of my child. Really? Really? It happens all the time. And even for people who would never do the sexual abuse or the physical abuse, I remember talking to a minister a few years ago about a very dear friend of mine whose son was just in one problem after another. And both of us loved my friend, so we weren't trying to be mean about him. And I remember vividly this other minister, and again, we love this guy, saying to me, you know, I think that boy would be a lot different if our friend focused more on loving his son than he did on making money. Because he's never there. He's never there. But he's rich. Now, I'm not against making money. Someday, before I die, I intend to. Maybe that's more of a wish. But do you understand what I'm saying? It's easy to rail against the people who killed their children. It's easy to rail against the people who sell their children. And what they're doing is horrendous. It's easy to rail against these mothers who would eat their children. That's all horrendous. But maybe we should apply it to American culture and think, what in the world are we doing to our children? Now, none of us is a perfect parent. There's not a perfect parent here. You do understand that, right? And I'm not trying to make us all feel guilty because we've been imperfect. We have. Our parents were imperfect before us. Their parents imperfect before them. And rest assured that when your children have children, they will be imperfect as well. But I'm talking about people who put their own desires and cravings and wishes above those of the needs of their children to be protected and cared for and loved and nurtured. The next verse. So, we cooked my son and ate him. Change that sentence to our culture. So I abused my daughter and destroyed her. So I neglected my son and abandoned him. So I beat my son and made him afraid. Insert your own sentence there, if you've done any of that stuff. The next day I told her, your turn. Bring your son so we can have him for supper. But she'd hidden her son away. Her complaint was not that she had eaten her baby. Her complaint was the other woman wouldn't let her eat hers. You say, well, good for the other woman. I have no pity for that other woman. She was the one who had the idea. Let's eat your child. Do you think that makes her any better? Look at the next verse. When the king heard the woman's story, he ripped apart his robe. Since he was walking on the city wall, everyone saw that next to his skin, he was wearing coarse burlap. That's what people wore when they were in mourning. And also that's what people would wear when they were begging God to intervene. I don't know if anybody grew up enough in the country to be around coarse burlap. Anybody remember what a burlap bag was? You remember how rough it was just to pick it up and haul it around? It was full of corn or whatever else you were hauling. Can you imagine wearing that next to your skin? I have enough trouble if there's a tag on my undershirt. Just drives me nuts. Imagine how that, you say, why would people do that? So that they would humble themselves before God. Basically, it's a way of saying, I'm humiliating myself. I'm going through all this pain to show you that I am not asking for something wonderful for me. I'm begging you, please do something. This king had been prostrating himself before God. He had been begging God, deliver us from the enemy, deliver us from the enemy. And so when he heard what these women were doing, he tore his robes. You might think, well, his first reaction would be to execute these two women. I think I might have been thinking that way. But he is angry, and he doesn't take it out on the two women, or at least it's not told us that he takes it out on the two women. He rips open his robe, and now everybody can see that this king, who's walking around in the king's splendor, underneath is showing that he has been begging God for deliverance from this situation. But look what happens next. And he called out, God, do his worst to me and more. If Elisha, now this is the prophet, if Elisha still has a head on his shoulder at this day's end, What? The women ate the child, and you're going to kill the prophet. Look at the next verse. Oh, let me back up. Let's say with that verse. Why does he want to kill the prophet? Because he's mad. Why is he mad at the prophet? He's not really mad at the prophet. He's mad at God. But you can't kill God. Can you? Why is he so angry with God? Have you noticed, particularly in our culture, that people are always wanting to blame somebody else for the problems? I mean, we live in a culture where that if you walk onto somebody's property and try to break into their house and you get hurt, you sue them. Right? I mean, it's always somebody else's fault. One of my favorite stories from when I was a kid was a sister who swung at her brother, and he ducked, and she hit a vase that was very expensive, and it shattered, and she yelled at her mother, "Mom, he made me break the vase." It's his fault because he ducked. If he hadn't ducked, it wouldn't have ever happened. It's just the way we do things in our world. Now, he's blaming God. Why do you think he's blaming God? I think when you blame other people, there can be several reasons for it. But in this particular case, it's because of the fact, who would be feeling most responsible for those people starving to death when the reason they're starving to death is because there's an army out there and they don't go fight that army? Who feels most responsible for not taking that battle outside those city walls? The king. The executive. The commander-in-chief. Because if he had taken his army and marched out those walls and fought those guys, there's a chance they can win. There's no chance they're going to win if they stay in there and starve to death. Can you see that? Why doesn't he go? Because he's pretty sure they're going to lose. So he stays in there. To some degree now, this guy's being a coward. Now here he is in his cowardice. And he's watching his people starve to death. Do you think he's got to be feeling some responsibility for their starving to death? But it doesn't appear that he admits to himself he's a coward. Do you see that? So who does he blame? God. I'm not doing anything, but you see God